I'd like to call this hearing of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee to order. And first, thank everybody for coming out today. We appreciate the interest and that you're showing here today, and of course, the committee coming to Louisiana, South Louisiana, New Orleans it's an important part of the world for the United States of America to be here. And this is our kickoff hearing roundtable. I guess this is actually a roundtable, isn't it? Listening session. I do so many of these, I'm confusing myself. But Garrett's got his computer out, so I guess we're all behind the 8 ball here today if Graves has got his computer out. But again, thank you, welcome. And I want to thank Garrett Graves for hosting us and pushing us and helping us set up today's listening session, as well as a tour we're going to take of South Louisiana after this. And with that, I'd like to yield to Garrett. Or Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And most importantly, look, everyone up here has districts around the country, and I know that have demands back home. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be here. We are going to be doing this listening session, and this afternoon we're going to be going up in Blackhawks and spending pretty much all afternoon flying around and seeing a lot of things you're going to be talking about. Louisiana is unique in that I think we're one of the only states in the nation where you talk about the WRDA bill, you talk about water resources, you talk about the Corps of Engineers, and you have a pretty amazing understanding in the general population. Now, what's unfortunate is that what got us to this point to where people really understand this is, as we have been through in the last 10 years, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Gustav, Hurricane Ike, Hurricane Isaac, and in fact, President Robotham was even telling me that the remnants of Patricia caused extensive flooding in some areas. People have become very familiar with the management of water here, unfortunately. But I really want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the chairman. We have been talking about kicking off a new water resources bill for 2016, and we had been asking to try and get people down here, and I think everyone here has been here at least once before, and I know they'll all be back, but the reason that they agreed to come down here is because this place really is the laboratory for everything. You can look at sea rise, you look at subsidence, you look at we have every type of Corps of Engineers project going on down here, so we really can take people here and show them navigation projects, flood control, ecosystem restoration, hurricane protection, you name it. We have them all here.
I lost last year. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me just say that Chairman Schuster has been a magnificent friend, but more importantly, he's been a magnificent friend to Louisiana and to the needs that we have, and we know we have many needs, and we are a state, and especially a district that is very much reliant on the federal government in terms of transportation needs and other things. But one thing we do know is that he comes from good stock because his father did the exact same thing. So I am sure that he will continue to be a friend. And then I'll say, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you for taking the time to hold this event in our district. It's great that so many members on a bipartisan basis were willing to come together and see and hear for themselves the important effects that decisions made in Washington have on the people in Louisiana. This region of the country is at a forefront of water resources development. We have, unfortunately, far too much experience with the damage that can be caused by failures in our protection system. As we rebuild, restore, and improve, we're also showing the nation that challenges that come from balancing the competing needs for navigation, flood control, environmental protection, and restoration. However, we're also showing the nation what can be done when everyone with a stake in these projects can come together to create and execute a plan. The Louisiana Coastal Master Plan is an example of state and federal policymakers across the country about how things can be done. That's why I think it's great that you all are here today. Having conversations between all the stakeholders is a great model to follow, especially in this policy space, where so often different aspects get discussed independently of each other, even though they are all connected. It's crucial that we have a unified discussion so that we can learn from all the experts and make better policy moving forward. Mr. Chairman, I will submit my entire statement for the record, but I will just close with, I think what makes us smart in Washington and as public servants is that when we recognize what we know and what we don't know, And when we know what we don't know, we bring experts in to tell us. And I think that this is a great example of that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be in your district again. I want to start off just where Cedric ended there about bringing the experts in front of us. This is a listening session. We have listening sessions and roundtables which differ from hearings significantly, and I believe that there certainly is a place for hearings on the official record. But these roundtables and these listening sessions, if there's a give and take here, if we're listening and you're talking about the issues, we learn quite a bit that helps us when we craft legislation in Washington. So I've got a script here, but I'm not going off my script. And I would encourage all of you not to go off your scripts. And I think everybody here, we've been in front of you before, you've been in front of us. We know where you're coming from. We know you don't have to do an ad for your industry, but just really get right into it on the issues. What are the issues that you see as we move forward? What didn't get addressed in the Word of 2014? What are issues that are positive things that are happening that you'd like to see more of? But that's really what we're here for. So again, I would encourage you, do away with the advertisement for the industry. We know about the tugs and the barges and how many of them there are, but really the problems that you face. Because this is an issue that whether it's ports, harbors, inland waterways, flood protection, environmental restoration, these are the things that we need to be able to address. And when you go around the country, all those things are in every district. Are important. And I think the vote we got on the last Word bill of 417 to 5 really demonstrated that when you travel around the country and you go into a different city, they might not have a port or a waterway, but they've got a flood protection problem, or they got an environmental restoration problem. So this is something that's important to the entire nation. And working together with you folks as stakeholders, learning from the stakeholders is critical to us. I say all the time to people in the maritime industry and in your industries and doing what you do is, if you don't tell us the problems out there, we're not out there every day working in the field, working with the Corps. It really comes from you folks that we learn these problems and issues, and we need to do another water resources bill. It was 7 years before 2014 when we did the last one, and historically over the last 40 or so years, it's been every Congress you do a water resources bill, and so we're going to get back to regular order to move a bill. Bob Gibbs, as the chairman of the Water Resources Committee, will be lead on that effort. Going through his subcommittee, did a great job last time. But again, as we look forward, the number I always like to put out there is the size that the American population is going to be. It took us 65 years to go from 200 million to 300 million people. In 2005, we crossed the 300 million threshold, and they said at that time it'll take 32 years to go from 300 to 400 million people. And we're 10 years into it. We're on our way to 400 million, and 400 million people need to move around, and they need a lot of stuff to live their lives, to produce when they do in the factories and produce jobs. So we've got a challenge ahead of us, but we need to.
95 projects would have been in their annual report. So we're working through that with the Corps. And keep in mind, there's really 5 criteria that the Corps has to use that wouldn't put it in the annual report. And so it's pretty, I think the Word of 14 was really clear of what should be in the report, pretty much everything, except for those 5 criteria, and I don't want to take time to mention it. I think everybody probably knows what they are. But, it's up to the people's representatives to determine what's going to get authorized, prioritized, and looked at, and not up to the bureaucracy of the Corps to make that decision. P3s, the Corps won't issue implementation guidance until the appropriation process is they fund it. WIFIA, water infrastructure financing, who's a big advocate for. The Corps is still drafting the implementation guidance. Non-federal contributions, Corps is still drafting that guidance. Funding for Section 214, the Corps has issued the implementation guidance and made it permanent, so we're really happy about that part. The Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, in Word of 2014, we put incentives there to encourage the administration and appropriates to hit certain targets to where trust fund dollars could be used, and good and bad news is the appropriators are trying to hit those targets. The administration is not. Inland waterways, We provide a lot of flexibility with the Olmsted Lock and Dam project in Paducah, Kentucky, to free up funding, as you all know. So that's moving forward. We've got new capital projects, lock projects up in Bill's area in the Lower Mon. Also, in legislation that was passed since WRDA to increase the user fee on the diesel user fee in the Waterway Trust Fund to 29 cents. So that's moving forward. Currently, there's 17 chiefs reports have been delivered to Congress since the enactment of WRDA 2014 a year ago, June. And I think moving forward, Chairman, obviously, we did a lot of reforms. I like to say 2/3 or more of WRDA 2014 was reforms. The challenge is getting all that implemented and get the work done we need to get done in a cost-efficient manner. I think in the WRDA 2016, it's going to be probably some tweaking, make sure that the implementation of 2014 gets accomplished and moving forward, and authorization of new projects and studies. So I don't think that the next bill will be as encompassing as the last bill, but it's going to be finessing some of the things that need to be, I think, addressed. And that's why we're really excited to hear from all you today to see what the challenges are, because when you bring things to us, it's a lot easier for us to, when we go back to talk to the Corps, when we have, information. Information's powerful, and that's why they think it's so important. So I yield back, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. As I said, this is a listening session, so I'd encourage you to get right to the point, because what we want to do is I'm going to give you each an opportunity to say something. And for members on the panel up here, if you've never participated in one of these, this isn't about me doing all the questions. Anybody can jump in anytime. I would just encourage you, if you watch the Republican presidential debates, don't step on people. Be respectful. Put your finger up. I'll make sure we get to you if you have a question. And again, be respectful. But if there's a line of questioning and there's an issue that somebody needs to jump on, if there's something happened up in the Hudson River Valley that you need, just make sure you respectfully butt in there and continue the line of questioning, because this is for us. It's really about learning what's out there. So again, I'll recognize each of you individually. Try to stay away from the commercial and go right to the issues, and that would be greatly appreciated. And we'll start off with Mr. Kyle Graham, who's the Executive Director of the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. Mr. Graham.
Thank you very much, and welcome back to Louisiana, and thank you for the invitation. You've probably recognized, you'll hear several different types of phrases about coastal Louisiana over time. I'm over an agency called the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. Our goal is to build coastal protection and coastal restoration projects. We're the ones who put forward the master plan. We're the ones who implement that master plan. As part of that, we work with partners with the Corps of Engineers. We work very, very closely with them. You mentioned many of the issues that you see around the nation, whether they're navigation, ecosystem restoration, or flood control. The answer for us is yes. We have all of those. What's amazing about our master plan is it looks at everything comprehensively. And when we sit down and partner with the Corps of Engineers and we're working through individual projects, where we see a huge part of the difference between our implementation styles is that we have a plan. The Corps of Engineers is often focused on individual projects, and probably our largest stumbling block amongst our work with the Corps of Engineers is the lack of an overall restoration plan. It's not for a lack of effort. You've authorized this before. You've actually authorized it not only in the Water Resources Development Act, but it was also authorized in the Restore Act. But when we sit down at the table and we start thinking about how to best do that work, there's a significant difference between where we invest the dollars. You've spent tens of billions of dollars in coastal Louisiana on the Mississippi River, but the handling of that sediment on the Mississippi River has been to a detriment of our coastal wetlands, the very wetlands that protect our ports, the very wetlands that protect our communities. So without the wetlands, we had flood control issues. So we spent tens of billions of dollars on in Louisiana, and how come we're not making as much momentum with our federal partners as we can is the lack of a comprehensive plan of where the dollars are. The Restore Council has $1 billion. They've had it for 3 years. They can't come up with where to put the money because they don't have a comprehensive plan for the Gulf. So as we're thinking forward with our future dollars, we need to focus on that comprehensive plan. Welcome to the coast. I get the privilege of spending quite a bit of time with you today. I think Congressman Graves sometimes regrets that. For those of you that are in the room, full disclosure, I used to work for Congressman Graves, so if you're a staff here, you can survive this. We'll see how it goes. But again, welcome to Louisiana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graham. And next is Ms. Natalie Robottom, the president of the St. John Parish, Louisiana.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Congressman. It's an honor to be here and speak on behalf of St. John the Baptist Parish and the entire river region. Both Congressman Richmond and Congressman Grave represent our area along the river. The Mississippi River runs through St. John. We have access I-10, I-55, which is an evacuation route for southeast Louisiana, and I'm here because of the devastation caused by Hurricane Isaac in 2012. We've never had flooding that occurred as it did in the hurricane. We had 6,000 homes flooded. We evacuated about 7,000 residents. We lost our water system to the majority of our parish, and we were cut off from our resources and evacuation because both of our interchanges were underwater. Airline Highway, which is another evacuation route, was shut off. And of course, we're home to major industry. Marathon Oil Refinery is in St. John the Baptist Parish. The nuclear plant is across the river from St. John. And whenever there's the evacuation route is disturbed, none of these facilities can start back up and start providing the rest of the country with what they need. After 44 years and a lot of work from our Congress, from our senators, from people in this room, people with CPRA who included levee protection in their master plan, a chief's report was completed this June of 2015. Again, that's after 44 years of study and a disaster that devastated our parish, and millions, billions of dollars of restoration or rehab or recovery dollars that were pushed into St. John. But the threat remains. As a result of Hurricane Patricia, that was nowhere near our area, we flooded for 5 days with tidal flooding, with limited access to the interstate, to our water system, our interchanges, and people could not leave their homes. The water was in the streets coming in from the Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Maurepas abut our parish. And when the tide's high, when the lake's high, when the wind pushes in surge, that water comes into our parish. So our request here today is to expedite the construction of the West Shore Levee Project. That's, again, been on the books for 44 years. And it's not until 2012, followed by Hurricane Sandy, that we started to receive the attention that I think we deserve. And it's critical that the funding and construction for this project be expedited to protect not only our industry, our residents, and entire southeast Louisiana. Because if the evacuation routes are shut off through St. John, then they're shut off to southeast Louisiana. And this is something that, I'm very pleased to know that Kyle and his office is in support of this. Full disclosure, I worked with Garrett in Governor Jindal's office. So Garrett is very familiar with me as well. And, we're very glad to have people like Congressman Richmond and Congressman Graves working on behalf of us because they know firsthand. They were both in our parish during Hurricane Isaac. They saw the flood waters. They were helping us get our residents to safety, helping us to get the resources into our parish for recovery. But this is something that can occur every year. And we can't afford to have that without levee protection. So again, we implore you to listen very carefully. There's a packet that you've received with photos of what just happened, again, with no hurricane, the flooding that existed in our parish as a result of Hurricane Patricia. We also have information and a resolution asking to move forward with the funding for this very important project that will not only protect St. John, it will also protect St. Charles and St. James Parish, and of course the Port of South Louisiana, which I'm sure Mr. Oclan will address in his remarks. Again, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I see that someone just gave Mr. Wood water. Some other want to make sure everybody has water here because this goes on. I think folks' mouths are going to start to dry, especially when there's six.
Everybody here who's traveled to make this discussion a success. As you tour our infrastructure later on today, you're going to see firsthand the importance of flood damage risk reduction in our area, and also the importance of these types of facilities for the economy of the nation and for the public welfare of the people that live in this area. So As a member of the Board of Directors of NASMA, I want to ask the committee to consider the following comments and recommendations as you go through your deliberations on the next WRDA. First of all, with regards to levee safety, WRDA 2014 has a provision in there regarding vegetation management policy. And it calls for action to be taken on those guidelines no later than 18 months after the implementation of WRDA 2014. We have some concerns about that right now because up to the present time, we haven't seen anything yet on what that might be, and there really hasn't been any engagement between the non-federal interests in the Corps on that vegetation management policy. And secondly, with regards to levee safety, we do have a recommendation for a slight revision to the language that was included for levee safety programs in general, and that is we would recommend that you would include regional flood control districts along with state and tribal entities as being eligible for recognized levee safety programs. Regional districts generally are governmental entities that span multiple local jurisdictional areas, and typically they possess the expertise necessary to operate and maintain these systems that are very large and protect a whole lot of people. Then moving on in general, with regards to implementation guidelines, we would recommend including some stronger language in the next WRDA that would require the Corps to engage with non-federal sponsors in developing that implementation guidance. And up to now, there's been little or no engagement with non-federal interests regarding the implementation guidance. Generally, what happens is the guidance is developed, and then we get a copy of it, but not a lot of dialogue or interaction in the meantime. And next on Section 1014, that deals with the study and construction of water resources development projects by non-federal interests. We would recommend including provisions that would allow incremental and periodic reimbursements to the non-federal sponsor for discrete segments of the work, generally as an option to reimbursing the non-federal sponsor at the end of the work. And also, we think it would be a good idea to allow a local sponsor to be eligible for reimbursement for the federal share of the work if such work is later recommended by the Chief of Engineers and approved by the ASA. And finally, we still have concerns about the potential impact of the federal flood risk management standards on several of the programs that are situated in the Corps, and particularly things that deal with the 408 permitting process and perhaps the PL 8499 programs. And so, we would, ask that you take a look at that. Perhaps there may be needed some changes in the next WRDA that deal with that. And finally, I will say that NASMA will be providing some draft language to staff probably by the end of this month, so you can keep an eye out for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. You didn't work around, or you're not related to Garrett Graves, though you didn't say.
I'm not directly related to Garrett Graves that I know of.
Mr. Turner, I just want to let you know, thank you for bringing up the federal flood risk management. Actually, the chairman is committed to doing a hearing on this topic. So thank you, Mr. Turner.
I did. I must have if Garrett says so. Next, Ms. Amy Larson, President of the National Waterways Conference, someone that's always in front of the committee. We appreciate your support and guidance through the last WRDA bill and help moving it forward. So with that, Ms. Larson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate being here. But as Congressman Graves just trumped all of the remarks I had if he said you're having a hearing on FFRMS, thank you. There are significant concerns about that, which we can talk about another day. But really it is, in the interest of full disclosure, when Garrett was with CPRA, he was a member of NWC. So now it is very fitting that Congressman Graves is hosting us here. And we can see the need, you'll see this afternoon, the need for multiple projects and the benefits that are accrued by those projects. And I think it's important as we go into the next WRDA to look at these multiple benefits, look at things as a system. Our members do include every, I don't know why that's...
The AV people said these three could not be turned off.
All right, let's try that one. Is that better? Okay. So we have significant concerns with the implementation of WRDA 14 so far. Some of those things may need to be tweaked, and I'll save a lot of those questions as we get into the Q&A. But first and foremost is the new annual report requirement, Section 7001. And if Mr. DeVan just won't make it to the top of the heap if everything goes to O&M. So we're trying to work with other stakeholders and looking at how do we raise that top line number, because you'll have authorized projects that just won't get through the OMB channel. So I think it's something to think about as we go through this process. In addition to 7001, I'd like to echo the comments, the concerns about Section 408. The Corps has not yet put out its implementing guidance on Section 1007. We are working with the Corps on that because in addition to impacts on the FFRMS and other programs, in general, the engineering circular for 408 is now looking at projects, anything within a project boundary, as opposed to what the statute calls, which is for works, levees, flood walls, and those sorts of things, which means that it's an extra regulatory burden. So a proposal may need 404, Section 10, and a full 408, which is now being construed more like a feasibility study. So we had a conference call with some of our members yesterday with the Corps on 408, and they are interested in hearing back from stakeholders, which we intend to do. But as this committee looks at WRDA implementation, particularly Section 1007, that may be something that needs further refinement, is how 408 applies, because we don't need extra regulatory burden on people, including, for instance, modifying an existing roadway on the side of a flood control lake that may be acres away. There's no impact on the actual work of the project, but a 408 is still required. So I would just draw that to your attention. The other section is Section 1024, and this is the provision that allows non-federal sponsors to provide emergency goods and services in an emergency. And the manager's report talks about emergencies resulting from lack of O&M. Unfortunately, that section is being construed only to apply to emergencies that resulted from some sort of natural disaster. So if, for instance, you had aging miter gates or gates that collapsed, if they collapse in a flood event, Section 1024 is deemed to apply. If, however, they simply collapse through lack of maintenance, 1024 is not being construed to apply. And I think that's what was intended if you look at the language in the manager's report. So that's another issue that we're following, and we're hoping that may need to be refined, and we've got some draft language on that as well. So I've got several other comments on other WRDA provisions, but I think in the interest of time, I'll turn it over to my colleague here for his opening comments.
O'Quinn. Yeah, thank you. Right, a little bit. O'Quinn.
Just call him Paul.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster and Congressman Graves, Richmond, members of the committee. It is indeed an honor for me to be here today, and I speak here today not just for the Port of South Louisiana, but for all ports across our great United States, having been invited by the American Association of Port Authorities and your committee to be here. I won't spend any time talking about my port, but that I did leave you some information about the Port of South Louisiana, America's largest tonnage port. And when asked to speak about the port, I always say it's probably the most important port you probably never heard of. And after I finish, people say, you're right, it is probably the most important port we never heard of. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. If I were to keep my remarks very brief, I could sum this up in two words as far as the ports are concerned. That would be infrastructure and dredging. Y'all hear that over and over and over again, dredging and infrastructure. But I consider the Mississippi River to be one of Louisiana's, if not the United States' greatest natural resources. and the 215 Mississippi River stages and dredging requirements highlight the maintenance and dredging problems we have. 2015 saw extended high flows and sediment loads on the Mississippi River that in dollars annual federal appropriations for navigation channel construction. Constructing and maintaining the nation's 21st century maritime infrastructure is critical. Public ports are doing their part. The American Association of Port Authorities' most recent survey shows ports anticipating investing $46 billion, that's a B, billion dollars over the next 5 years in port facilities. At the Port of South Louisiana alone, we have identified $66 million in capital investment. In addition, in the Port District of the South Louisiana, we have $23.5 billion of new industry coming that's been announced projects. A lot of these are foreign countries for the first time, foreign direct investment. And we expect to announce another $11 billion of new industry in the first quarter of next year. That's a lot of new industry, new jobs, and we're doing our part, and it's all because of the Mississippi River and the ports along the Mississippi River. Approximately half of these new projects are foreign companies representing foreign direct investment and thousands of jobs. I commend the committee leadership for recognizing the nexus between water resources, development, and economic prosperity. Federal investment in port-related infrastructures are an essential, effective utilization of limited resources, paying dividends through increased trade and international competitiveness, sustainable job creation, and over $340 billion annually in local, state, and federal tax revenues. I urge you, members of the committee, to develop and pass a Water Resources Development Act at the earliest possible time. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Woodruff, who is Director of Public and Government Affairs for the Kirby Corporation, is speaking here today on behalf of the Waterways Council. So, Mr. Woodruff, please.
Waterways Council is the voice of our inland system of ports and waterways and barge transportation for the nation. And our industry brought forth to this committee and to the Congress and administration prior to WRDA 2014 a capital development plan. And the purpose of that plan was to create a pathway of policy and funding to ensure that our inland waterway system could be reliable for the next 20 years. And this committee incorporated the bulk of those provisions, and WRDA 2014, I think, was truly a watershed event for the future of the inland transportation system in the nation. But as we're looking at WRDA 2016, I think we see some threats on the horizon to our ability to be able to execute that set of policies that was brought forward. And part of that is in that we just don't see it being executed the way that I believe this committee and the Congress intended. And I think that one of the things that Congress needs to explore, and I think it probably goes beyond this committee because I think everyone in this room understands that we need to compel the administration to do what Congress intends rather than ask them to do what you want them to do. I think the constitutional duty lies with the Congress to direct how the money of the nation is spent. And so I would love to see Congress retake some of that authority that has been given to the administration to say where all of our hard-earned money gets spent. And in particular, you mentioned the increase in fuel tax or fuel user fee that we asked for and that Congress provided. We did that to put that money into capital investments on our system, and we see an environment where even the second year out of the box, the administration doesn't even propose to spend that additional money and to simply let that accumulate in the trust fund. If that happens, we will not be able to achieve the 20-year vision that was set out in our capital development plan. So we need to make the investment, we need to spend the money, we need to spend it efficiently by implementing the policies that were set out in WRDA 2014. Another threat that we see is the creep of maintenance into the capital side of the formula, and thereby taking maintenance projects, deferring them packaging them up once they meet the cost threshold and say that it's a major rehabilitation and therefore should be taken out of the trust fund. Well, what that does is it takes that money away from the projects that truly are capital investments. And so we think that the committee should, in WRDA 2016, revisit the threshold for major rehabs. We think that a $50 million threshold is a much more appropriate level to keep the maintenance in the maintenance pie and the capital improvements in the capital improvements pie. There was a statement made down the table about trolls, and I would just say, from the perspective of our industry, beware the trolls, because I don't think they always share the policy views of this committee and the Congress. Be happy to.
Thank you very much. And that troll statement is attributed to Mr. DeFazio, who...
For two reasons. One is a defensive, one is an offensive reason. The defensive reason is simply this is our existential issue, obviously. If we don't do this right, then all of the good news that's coming out of our state over the past decade is not going to matter in 50 years because we're not going to be able to live and to work here. But also there is what I'd call an offensive opportunity or productive opportunity, and that is that if we can manage our water and learn how to live and work with water here in Louisiana, we're actually creating an industry. We're becoming effectively the Dutch of North America, and we're creating products and services that we can then sell as experts around the world, because increasing weather volatility, rising sea levels is a global phenomenon, and we happen to kind of be on the wet edge of the spear here. So we see it also as an economic opportunity. Specifically, relative to 2016 WRDA and some core reforms, I'd just like to give you 5 specific reforms that we might be able to consider going forward. The first is around speed. Our coast is eroding at an accelerating rate. We don't have time right now, the luxury of time, so the same speed and alacrity that was shown building the $15 billion flood protection post-Katrina, we'd like to see that applied in future projects by the Corps. The second is beneficial use. This is critical. Right now, we are literally pouring our restoration off of the outer continental shelf. We have to use that sediment in a way that actually benefits restoration. Not to do so defies logic, and I think is a definition of insanity. We have to give the Corps the authorization and the flexibility to do that. The third is permit efficiencies. We've seen some projects take 2 or 3 years to get permitted. Obviously, while that's happening, our situation is getting worse. So anything we can do to preserve the integrity of the process, we're not trying to skip over a needed process, but to expedite it, obviously, we think is critical. The fourth is integration. The Corps has at least three missions. It's got navigation, it's got flood control, it's got restoration, and we'd like to do anything that we can in WRDA to encourage the Corps to think about those things, because they obviously intersect and sometimes contradict, to think about them together. The last and fifth is partnering. We'd very much like to encourage the Corps of Engineers to partner with the state and to partner with Kyle and his team and CPRA on implementing the State Coastal Master Plan. It's an excellent science-based document, and if they can work together, I think they're going to find some real efficiencies and they're going to be able to implement. And then just lastly, pulling out at the highest level, we've got an opportunity now with the Macondo, the BP settlement, to actually do this. It, in my mind, is kind of our best and last chance to do it right. And so let's make sure that the WRDA process is also coordinated with the Restore process, with the NDRA process, so that we're actually optimizing all of our resources to restore the coast, not just for Louisiana, but, as you all know very well, for the entire nation. Again, thank you for your time. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hecht. Thank all of you again for being here today and your bringing up the points that you have. I'll start the questioning off first to Mr. Graham, that the overall restoration plan. Can you talk a little bit about that, why you don't think the Corps is doing it, and also can you talk a little bit about the importance of flood protection with the wetlands, restoring those wetlands? I think a lot of places in the country, we know wetlands are important, but we hear a lot of places around the country where it's very difficult to move projects forward. We're talking about restoring them to save hopefully billions of dollars in damage if they're restored. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. And when I'm speaking of a plan, the comprehensive is not just restoration. It's how we handle navigation and restoration and flood protection, because it's all interconnected. Gosh, I can't believe I'm giving him credit, but I once had a wise leader who thought of sediment as one day being the currency for Louisiana. And when you sit back and think about it, we are on a major delta. And this major delta, it's different. When we're dredging in Louisiana, you don't have the same consequences as when you're dredging in Maine. Yet, with the federal government, with the Corps of Engineers, we're using the same suite of rules. That sediment, if it's not put on our delta is naturally compacting over time, and it's going to sink. So there's a consequence for not using that sediment to our wetland environments. They're literally drowning. With or without sea level rise, they're drowning. And so as we think about a comprehensive plan, how do we make sure that we're using that sediment as we're dredging? And we start dredging in Baton Rouge, but we just stir it up. We agitate dredge all the way to the bottom of the river before we pick it up. So how do we modify how we dredge to get that sediment into our wetlands? Because without those wetlands, our hurricane protection system is not designed for the Gulf of Mexico to be lapping up against the outside. It's designed to have wetlands in front of it so that you have a buffer there. And if you don't have those wetlands, you're impacting the flood protection system. And we're currently investing in all three, but we're not thinking about the investments together. And so when I think of a plan, that's kind of...
Currently, the sediment is not being able to be used to restore your wetlands?
It's not, because the purposes of the dollars being sent down here are for navigation only. And so the federal standard doesn't allow them to utilize those to match up with our mitigation or with our coastal restoration projects. When we beneficially utilize it, we only beneficially utilize it at the very bottom of the river, which isn't protecting, and it's not where we would want to rebuild those wetlands. So there's a way to, right? So down, and you're familiar with Louisiana, it's got the Bird's Foot Delta on the bottom. So it gets deposited down in the Bird's Foot Delta. So is one place you'll have handling areas down there, and there'll be beneficial use where wetlands will get built down in the Bird's Foot Delta. And the second is it gets deposited off the continental shelf. So those are two primary areas where it gets picked up. Once those areas are full, it literally gets picked up and pulled out to where it's no longer impacting navigation.
So, because I know up in my area, in the Great Lakes, the Corps, we have issues about open lake disposal, okay? And a lot of areas in the Great Lakes are not doing it. In Lake Erie they are, and that's lake they probably shouldn't be doing it. But the Corps seems to almost have a cultural bias. They think that's the only way to get rid of it the most economically. And that's why I guess you asked the question, and I know Mr. Heck talked about the beneficial use of sediment, and you talked about the wetlands, which to me makes a lot of sense, the little bit of knowledge I have about it. But the question is then, is it a legal issue or is this a cultural issue? The why the Corps is not more willing, or maybe it's a cost issue, maybe they see it as a cost issue and not putting the sediment in the wetlands.
Yeah, and folks can speak better to this, but I'll give you kind of my perspective, and I think it's both. One, when they get appropriated the dollars, it is appropriate just for navigation. And so they'll get it handed down there for the purpose of navigation. And then within that, they've decided that they have to do everything the same wherever they're working, and hence you get into the federal standard and the issue that whatever we do in Louisiana needs to be consistent with what we do in Florida, which needs to be consistent.
Well, the federal standard says it's got to be the most cost-efficient, environmentally safe, and so I think that's open to a broad interpretation.
Sure.
Mr. Rokita.
I thank the chairman. Thank you, everyone, for your discussion so far. Following up on this line of thinking, I'd like to go to Mr. Woodruff. Do you feel that the Corps needs to focus more of its dredging on non-navigation?
Well, here's what the problem is. We don't have enough money to take care of all of our ports and waterways, even using the absolute lowest cost dredging methodology. So you're starting at a deficit. There are very important things, as you've heard, that can be done with dredged material. It is an asset, not a liability. But if it costs twice as much to use it effectively for environmental restoration, then that means you're only doing half the dredging that needs to be done with that limited pot of money. And so I think we do need to look at it holistically to say, how do we invest enough into the system to ensure that we get the dredging done that needs to be done to maintain commerce, while at the same time efficiently and effectively using the dredged material, not just here, but throughout the entire Gulf Coast and many other places. We have opportunities to use that dredged material.
Thank you. So holistically means the three prongs that Mr. Graham's talking about.
Yes.
And then going quickly back to Mr. Graham, I'll yield back for a while. Mr. Graham, when you talk about the need for a comprehensive plan to do this three-pronged approach, are you saying that if there was a comprehensive plan, that the Corps would do it, or is there a legal impediment? Is there a legislative change that we need beyond mandating a comprehensive plan?
So I've only been doing this for 7 years. I can't figure out what the Corps does when the law is written certain ways and what it chooses not to do. And so I don't know that there's necessarily legal bounds, but I do think that if the dollars came down through those mechanisms and they were driven by the comprehensive plan and they allowed their leaders to lead. The Corps has tremendous people. Whether they're locally or they're in the division or whether they're in headquarters, but they're not able to lead with those decisions with the dollars that are given them for the benefits of their region. So I do think that there's a way that through the legislation and through the appropriations, you could start to turn that tide that would allow them to take the restoration dollars and combine it with the dredging dollars and combine it with the flood protection dollars to take care of what the federal interests are here, so that you're not just stuck with the navigation dollars for the dredging and the restoration side.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'm going to just remind my colleagues, just give me a signal, and Mr. Graves is up next, but then Mr. Cohen after that, so feel free to, okay. Mr. Graves.
Thank you. First of all, on the federal standard issue, I want to clarify something. Mr. Chairman, both of you, I think one of the problems is that, as Mr. Graham noted, largely what happens in many cases is the districts look and they say, okay, how much money do we have to dredge, for O&M for this navigation channel? And you will see the definition of federal standard adjusted based upon how much funds they have. The objective, as was noted, is to keep the channel dredged. And so if they have, $5 million in excess funds over what they think it's going to cost to dredge, the federal standard definition will evolve. You see extraordinary differences in what the federal standard is and how it is applied across the core districts. Now, I know you're about to bust your lid, Sean. Keep it under control.
Who is that?
Sean Duffy. He has been pushing the RAMP Act and a lot of things that I think Congressman Richmond and Congressman Bastani and others have been pushing to basically commit the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund tax to dredging. And what he would say, if I were channeling him, is he would basically say that if you truly dedicate the harbor maintenance tax, as the mariners or the maritime industry would like to see, you will have the funds that from the river higher up in the system, get it up into the areas where we need ecological restoration, and see the benefits that causes downstream in regard to reduced navigation dredging. A project Mr. Graham's doing right now, they're actually dredging the river down to 90 feet in one area that we will be seeing today. And the idea there, while they're doing it for restoration purposes, that is going to create a borrow area that's going to refill. And so, again, reducing the amount of dredging that will be needed further downstream. Another idea on this is that you reconnect the river with the adjacent estuaries, and you allow for sediment extraction as naturally happened historically, and the sediment will flow out of the river, will help rebuild wetlands, and you end up potentially, if you engineer these things properly, you end up reducing the amount of navigation dredging, causing cost savings and better certainty for the navigation industry longer term.
I just want a quick comment. I think Congressman Graves makes a good point, because the federal standard was really something that was conceived by the Corps to protect the dollars they had for navigation and maybe shift some to the states, and different dredging projects. So the concept of the comprehensive plan and commingling dollars and not just look as tunnel vision of navigation is a really good concept, and I think that could go a long ways and actually be more efficient with the dollars and save money and get more done.
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you and Mr. Graves for your leadership in having this hearing, and Mr. Graves and his hospitality and his leadership, too. Mr. Graham, you talked about the comprehensive approaches necessary in taking navigation and eco and dredging all as one and not doing them separately. Are there some big issues concerning maybe in the long range the direction of the Mississippi River? I mean, I've read about some things about some spillways and some other areas where the river and how it flows could be affect the future of protection of this whole area. Are those on the boards?
Potentially, yes. And so we've looked out, when you start to use models and tools and data and start to look out over time, your error gets pretty great. But if you look out 50 years, there's definitely a stable Mississippi River out 50 years. And we are smart enough and can engineer things even beyond that. But that doesn't necessarily get to the point, is there a smarter way to do it? So as the sea level rises and as the plain sinks, are we just causing more and more sediment to drop out, increasing the cost of dredging, when perhaps we should be looking at a shorter channel? And we saw some of these studies that have been done from some of the independent groups that are starting to think about that. And maybe the answer is yes. And it's a federal navigation channel. There's going to need to be a lot more work there. But there definitely is potentially a time when the cost to maintain that channel exceeds the worth of that longer channel, and you might want to be thinking about a different avenue of getting in and out.
And when you said something about the plane sinking, that made me think. I'm from Memphis, so we think of Federal Express and how important air traffic is. And Federal Express was real important to 9/11. A lot of planes came through the Federal Express in Memphis to land. In emergencies, airports are real important. Are your airports here secure from flooding in the future if there's some disastrous situation, or is lakefront and/or Louis Armstrong safe from floodwaters?
So that gets to how successful we are at implementing our coastal program. So we've experienced 1,800 square miles of land loss over the last 80 years. And if we look forward another 50 years, we anticipate losing another 1,700 square miles. And so if that were to continue to creep inland, a lot of areas and communities would be threatened. But we're also expending a lot of dollars to help prevent that. And so that gets back to that comprehensive approach to make sure that we don't allow that to happen. Because we don't see it as necessary. Where we're a little different than perhaps New York is we have the sediment out of the river. It is possible, if we could wisely use that sediment, that we could offset sea level rise and offset the subsidence that's occurring. But we need to be able to utilize that sediment to do so.
Mr. Heck might have a better knowledge than somebody else here. Were your airports open during Katrina?
The old airport took water during Katrina on the runway. The new airport that's being built, however, is being built to new standards, and it's going to be open in about 2.5, 3 years, and it will be significantly higher than the current airport.
The new airport's the commercial airport. You mean Louis Armstrong?
Yes, sir.
How about the lakefront airport? Was it underwater?
Yeah, it's on the lake side of the levee, so absolutely it would have been underwater.
And is there any plan to try to preserve that integrity of that airport in case there's a disaster and a need for its use?
I'm not certain of that, Congressman.
The lakefront airport is back open. There's still some projects, and I think it's a good example when we talk about the Corps and the federal government, just about vision. And I think that's pretty much what we've been talking about, that there's a project you can keep investing in mitigation in terms of after the incident, but if we just lift some of the seawalls that support the lakefront airport, then the lakefront airport would not have as much risk in a storm. But when Michael talks about the airports being open, Louis Armstrong was open in terms of being able to handle planes. The terminal was not open, and of course it was used as. But the one thing that Mr. Oakland did not talk about when we started talking about dredging and the future is that the effect of the widening of the Panama Canal, the new vessels, and the opportunity that we have to expand our trade in the United States, which I think is very important, because we all talk about the fact that 95% of the consumers are not in the United States, and we need to get to them. So I would like him to just mention what he thinks the impact of widening the Panama Canal has, and what's the optimum depth that we're trying to get to when we dredge.
Well, we have to at least get to 50 feet minimum. That's important for these huge
What
new
are you at
vessels.
now? What's your depth now? What's your depth now?
It runs about 45 to 47 feet right now, but those extra feet mean all the difference in the world, especially at the mouth of the river where they enter the Mississippi River. We've had studies done by economic professors that indicate to the Port of South Louisiana that we expect cargo to increase by 15% if we do absolutely nothing, but just think how much more. It's all about competition. We're competing with the world, And when that Panama Canal opens up with these giant ships coming through, we're gonna have to be ready to be competitive. And that's what this dredging is all about, keeping all the ports across the United States competitive with what's going on. Out of the 7 grain elevators in my port district, 4 of them are operated by Archer Daniels Midland. They ship grain to 54 different countries. So you can imagine how competitive. Those 54 countries can buy that grain anywhere they want. Right now, we're benefiting from that by being competitive. But if we don't maintain, the dredging of the river and coastal restoration, let me tell you how it's all connected. President Rowbottom's parish is right in the middle of my port district. When it floods there, it affects my port. 9 people were flooded by Isaac. 9 employees within my office were flooded. Their homes were flooded by Isaac. That's an impact that flooding has on ports. And coastal restoration is important to all of us. Monday night, I was at Nicholls State University in Thibodeau, and they had a film on what they're doing for coastal restoration. And Dr. Bruce Murphy and I immediately decided that we're going to try to find a way that the port of South Louisiana can get involved in their efforts for coastal restoration, and because we're all in this together. I mean, it doesn't do me a bit of good to have a great port when the coast gets eaten up and find out I'm on the Gulf of Mexico instead of in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, So I hope I answered your question, Congressman. Thank you for bringing it up.
Appreciate you pointing out the Panama Canal. We took a group of members down there earlier in the year to see the Panama Canal, and it's a project that's going to take less than a decade or about a decade to do. It's coming in around the budget that was proposed, and 2 takeaways I think our group had was, number one, what a massive project and what it's going to do, should help us all out if we're prepared for it. The second thing was, thank goodness we don't own it anymore, because it'd never get done on time or under budget. So, maybe one of the wisest things Jimmy Carter did was give it back to the Panamanians. But with that, Mr. Babin.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly am glad to be over here in New Orleans. I'm your neighbor. I represent Port of Houston in the 36th Congressional District, Southeast Texas. And good to see my friend, Mr. Woodruff, over here with Kirby. And it's very similar, the problems that we have, and I actually have 4 ports. Port of Houston happens to be the biggest one. Very similar problems, Mr. O'Quinn. I think it's just the nature of being on the Gulf Coast. We have our dredging situation is a constant burden. And the problem we've had, besides only getting 30% back from our Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, it's just a constant battle with dredging and we're trying to get ready for Panama and Panamanian larger vessels as well. But we've got a situation in the Houston Ship Channel, which we call the Bayport flares, and we've been worried it's a safety issue. And so the Army Corps of Engineers has told us that they can't spend over the 902 limit, even though it's a safety issue. And so my Democrat friend colleague, and Gene Green and I have introduced a bill, 3315. It's called the Waterway Safety Improvement Act, and we want to know, we've got to have the Corps to have the flexibility to come in and do the things that need to be done, especially if it's a safety issue. And I think you can address this, and also, Matt, if you don't mind as well. We can't get this done. And I talked to somebody just a little while ago when I first walked in, and I can't remember who it was, that said that the Corps really does have the authority to go ahead and spend over the 902 limit if it's a safety issue. But nevertheless, we're introducing legislation to take care of this problem. And what I wanted to know was, with this flexibility, what would this mean not only to the Port of Houston, Port of Beaumont, Port of Orange that I represent, but also all the member ports?
Those are the opportunities that challenge people to maintain the type of performance that the nation expects of our transportation industry. And so it's important to commerce, it's important to the environment, it's important to the lives of the people who deliver the goods that America depends on to take care of issues like this. And so I can't think of anything that's more important than safety.
Absolutely. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate all you witnesses, and Garrett, thank you for having us here as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Babbitt. Mr. Graham talked about it, and some others about a holistic approach is what we're talking about to the core. Some of the others from a perspective where you come from, I heard from Mr. Graham on this, but in your different areas that you represent, can you talk about the need for a holistic approach that we need to look at? Is it happening in anywhere you see it, or is it something that we desperately need the core to start looking at that approach? Ms. Larson.
There's been a lot of discussion about watershed planning and this holistic approach, and when we see these kinds of examples, it makes perfect sense. But the other thing that plays into this is that each of these projects has a cost share and has a local sponsor, so whatever percentage that they're contributing to it. And so you have to factor that in when we're looking at watershed planning, and I think that's why it hasn't gone further, been further developed, gone further down that path. Looking at the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project, I think 40% of that goes to mitigation and other costs, but they are the local sponsor and they are responsible for that. When you're talking about CPRA, I think you have your funding allocated for that, but bringing in the local sponsors will be critical to decide how you go about doing that, because they still are on the hook for their cost share and O&M after.
I think when you talk about a holistic approach, it's sort of like the old story about the elephant and people touching one part of it, and they say, well, this is what a holistic approach is to me. I see so many opportunities to look at things holistically, whether it's the uses of dredge material, whether it's in the cost-benefit determinations of the value to the nation. We use a different set of cost-benefit analysis tools to determine the value of a waterways project than is used in the Tiger program to do other maritime transportation related projects. We use different discount rates. I think there is a great opportunity to look at so many things much more holistically, so we really determine what's best for the nation, what's the best investment in the nation's dollars.
I would agree. I think also when you're talking about holistic, we have to be holistic in the financial sense and talk about net present value. And so the beneficial use issue is the clearest example of that, whereas it might be slightly less expensive or more expensive depending on situation to just dump it off the OCS in the near term. Certainly over the long term, it's much, much less expensive to the nation to do the right thing with the sediment up front and place it where it protects the coast. It's kind of like that old thing, if you think restoration is expensive, try losing your coast.
Mr. Gibbs.
A couple, I want to go back on Mr. Graham, the Restore Act, there's $1 billion. How much has been expended? What's the balance?
None. There's some grants that are starting to get issued, but we, the state of Louisiana, even though the Transocean settlement was a couple years ago, we haven't received $1 yet. But inside and this is important because I think there is an opportunity, and Michael Hecht spoke about it. Our coastal program in Louisiana, just out of the whole BP oil spill, is going to receive a little more than $8 billion. So if we're doing things with that $8 billion over the next 15 years that can line up with the core and where the federal government wants to be, there's a lot of opportunity there. In that Restore Act, there's $1.5 billion or thereabouts for a comprehensive approach across the Gulf Coast. They call it Bucket 2. They've just put out a funding priority list for the first about $150 million that they hope to finalize next month. But there's a tremendous opportunity there to move forward, and not just Louisiana, but across the Gulf. And we sit in these meetings with all the different federal agencies, and there is an alignment on what to be done in the Gulf of Mexico from a federal perspective. And unfortunately, there is not. And we're going to see a spreading of those dollars in a wasted opportunity at the end of the day.
Well, under Order 14, because we don't have earmarks anymore, but this concept should go this way. The way I see it is the Corps has to be the lead agency, but they should be coordinating with all you folks on the Gulf Coast here and putting this together. And if it got the problem with the issue about not being able to commingle funds between navigation and flood control and eco restoration, develop a concentrated plan, then we need to talk about that, I think, in the next Water bill. I think this is probably biggest tweak maybe we got to do. But this has to happen because like you said, I agree, we're going to waste dollars if we're not. And I think you can extrapolate this even beyond the Gulf Coast, because we're talking about dredge material. Like I said, we got the issue up in the Great Lakes.
And so I think what the concern was is that in order to hit that target and to get the money where it needed to go, we needed to make sure that money wasn't diverted off to do maintenance, that we needed to throw more into it. That's where the 9-cent per gallon fuel fee increase came into. You got to get all that money there in that pot the right size to get those that suite of projects done. And the concern is that without raising that threshold, that we'll see things that are really deferred maintenance packaged up into a major rehabilitation project, and thereby divert the funds that are needed for some of those other projects that are up on the list.
You also made a comment that the administration isn't proposing even to spend the extra 9 cents.
That is correct. Their proposal doesn't spend even their view of what the 9 cents would raise. They say that the nation has higher priorities for those funds than what we kick them into the federal fisc to pay for. Another thing is, quite frankly, the estimate that's been used in Congress for what the revenue is going to be is low, and the actual receipts would suggest that the current appropriations bills will not spend all that money that's coming in. So we could actually boost the system up this year to a level of $372 million if we applied all the money that's coming in and that actual receipts are suggesting will be available.
Are you fearful that that extra revenue in the trust fund will be shifted somewhere else? Or?
Absolutely. That was our fear from the outset, but it was important that we get these projects done, and so I think our industry took a leap of faith, and we're depending, quite frankly, upon the Congress to help ensure that that money gets spent for what it's intended.
Yeah, the Inland Waterway Trust Fund, I'm concerned same thing's going to happen to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. Same thing that happened before that to the Highway Trust Fund. We get these trust funds, and then we try to divert them and play a shell game.
I think our trust funds, if they were administered by anything other than the federal government, there would be people in prison.
I always like to say they don't know what the definition of trust is, you know.
Mr. Graves.
Thank you. I was actually going to ask you that very question, what happened if that would occur in the private sector. I want to go back and highlight a few things. Mr. Graham, we've talked about this comprehensive plan effort, and certainly planning is one thing, but do you believe that there are opportunities, if you took more of a holistic approach, that there are opportunities to, number one, have better care and restoration of the environment, number two, to have more resilient communities, and number three, to actually generate cost savings for federal taxpayers by approaching water resource management through a more holistic management regime?
Absolutely. I think there's tremendous cost savings. And if you look at just the federal investment over the last, pick 20 years, pick 10 years, it's tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in coastal Louisiana. If there is a holistic approach in place, I think that you need a fraction of that. I don't think that our flood protection systems would have been as threatened as they were. I don't think we'd be spending the dollars on coastal restoration if we had been better stewards of the sediment to start with.
Let me ask you another question. If you were a private citizzen, I guess you are a private citizen, aren't you?
You're my representative.
Congratulations. Okay, let's get another. If you were smart, no, seriously, he's a very bright guy. If a private citizen had taken actions as the Corps of Engineers in terms of how they have modified and managed the lower Mississippi River system, what would your legal status be? I know you understand what I'm saying, so let me give a little bit of background for folks here. The Corps of Engineers actually came and remanaged the way the Mississippi River naturally kind of flowed and occurred, and there have been some significant consequences that I think everyone at this table has experienced. And so I'm asking if as a private citizen you had done that, where would you be right now?
We'd be in trouble, but I also, to be fair, there is reasons for how we got to where we are. I mean, all of those silos were built and justified over time. What hasn't occurred is we haven't stopped to reevaluate where we are. You know, when we submit a project to the Corps of Engineers, we're required to have an adaptive management plan, so that as we're headed down a path, if what we're seeing here isn't quite where we thought we were, or if there's other impacts from those actions, we have to modify it. That hasn't occurred in the last 80 years in coastal Louisiana, and it needs to occur. We need to adjust the silos of how we were built so that we're not just focusing on these things to the detriment of others.
So you're saying that adaptive and agile are not adjectives that you'd use to describe the Corps of Engineers?
There are others that might be more appropriate.
President Rowbottom, you noted that obviously.
But people couldn't get in and out of our parish. Resources to help us out of our recovery were delayed because all the entrance and exits were underwater. His employees, even the ones who may not have been involved in flooding or their homes weren't flooded, couldn't get back to work. So it's a bigger picture than I think it has been painted in the past, but I do think it requires all prongs. We do have projects in the state's master plan that addresses coastal erosion. We've been doing some of those, but until the entire area is addressed in the same manner, which is adding back to our coastline, putting barriers out there to protect us against the surge that will come, and adding hurricane or risk reduction structures in the entire area, we're going to be in the same position over and over again.
Thank you. Just one more, and quickly, Ms. Larson, you have members that are all over the country, different water resource experts. Knowing how the Federal Corps of Engineers project development and delivery process works, this has evolved over decades and decades. Certainly, it is an amazing process that all of your members try and model themselves after, correct?
To be fair, I think we certainly can all give examples where projects have been studied and studied and studied to death. But I do think this committee in Word of 14 did implement into law 3x3x3. It's probably worth a follow-up to find out, is that working, and if not, why? Because certainly we've seen the release of a lot of those chiefs' reports. So no question, reforms are slow, change is slow. People are resistant to change. So in terms of the project development and delivery model, yeah, there need to be a lot of other fixes. My bigger concern right now, or equal concern, is that the Corps is focused more on regulatory issues to the detriment of this project development issue, whether it's 7001, whether it's 1024, or the 408 process. And so we, when the Corps is given the funds we've seen in this area, projects are developed and they are finished. We're giving incremental funding, projects aren't being finished, and now what's happening is there's an increased emphasis on regulatory, which in addition to the project development costs adds additional burden on the local sponsors as well. So I think that the regulatory system needs to be reviewed as well.
I just want to expand a little bit, because I know, and Ms. Larson, you're absolutely right. 3x3 and by 3, hopefully it's moving ahead like it's supposed to. I know the Corps. That was actually General Walsh's, gave conception of that. And then of course we did in 14 try to combine some of these studies, to streamline that. But I guess, Mr. Turner, you made a comment in your statement that we should require the Corps to engage with non-federal interest on the implementation of the guidelines on levee safety.
Yes.
Can you expand on what's happening or what's not happening? Because I think it kind of goes with it.
Sure. I mean, the implementation guidance is one of the important things that we have to deal with at least at my level when it comes to dealing with the Corps and the water changes that are made on this in this various cycles. And just to give you an example of one of the problems that we've having to deal with. In Word of 2014, there was a provision in Section 3017 to deal with what we're calling here future levy lifts for this new system that you are going to be seeing soon. And here's the issue. When this new system was being designed by the Corps, it was intended to be constructed in phases, particularly the earthen levees, okay? And so in this area of the country, you know, when you build a levee, it's going to subside over time, and of course, being on the coast, we're going to be experiencing sea level rise, and so the level of protection over time, if you do nothing for the project, will go down. Well, there's correspondence that shows that, you know, the Corps wrote the memorandums internally saying that, you know, we're designing this $14 billion system, but if we don't have provisions in the law that allow the federal government to participate in those future levy lifts within 3 or 4 years of completing the system, it could be below the standards required to meet the NFIP. And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing these things falling down to those levels. And so in an effort to address that, Section 3017 was enacted. But the problem is in the Corps' implementation guidance, they're saying that in order for them to participate with these future levy lifts, they have to do a general reevaluation report. And that takes a lot of time, and it's a minimum of $3 million, 50% of which is cost shared. But one of the maddening things is they can't even start on that until there's some appropriation somewhere along the line that would allow them to begin the process. And so up to now, there has been no movement on that. And it just seems odd to me that, you know, you spend $14 billion to build a brand new system to protect an area like this, and it has a shelf life of 3 or 4 years. I mean, come on, I don't think that's what Congress intended. And so the whole
on the wall. You know, this was said at WCI yesterday, and so this is all very important, Chairman. I thank you for both Chairman for your leadership in putting this together, and Mr. Graves for doing it. I came to this committee not as a freshman, but after I've been here, was here a term or two, and I asked, to be on this committee because of what happened in Ward 14. From a rank-and-file guy who's now vice chairman of budget and some other committees, and on committees where we literally have bar fights sometimes over some of these issues, to see what happened in Ward 14, thanks to both of your leadership, was really transformative for me. So now I'm sitting here and I'm hearing this discussion, and I'm seeing themes that do creep in to all committees in Congress. And one of these is one that Mr. Woodruff brought up, this idea that we ought to compel the executive branch to do what Congress intended. Now, isn't that the trick? It's something, it's really appalling. You know, I've come to Congress in 2011. I mean, in Indiana, frankly, we don't act this way between branches. And I'm just dumbfounded as to how it's allowed to happen here. So dumbfounded that I've talked to a Supreme Court justice, United States Supreme Court justice twice about the problem privately. And the retort that justice made was, listen, Congress does not write its laws with enough specificity. We leave I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed, and a lot more than that, to people unelected and not directly responsible to the people. Yet I hear my good friend Dr. Babin talk about the flexibility needed to do some things. You know, so I suspect there's a balance in all this. And starting with Mr. Woodruff, but if any of you would like to comment on what I'm bringing up here, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you use the word compel. And I appreciate you identifying the problem, but you know, whether it's the justice or the idea that the justice had or another idea, how do we effectuate what we intend when we write Ward 16?
Well, I think that part of it is, I think Congress overreacted when it imposed upon itself the earmark ban. I'm not going to question the fact that there were things done that Americans found not to be the right way to handle the nation's business. I'm not a scholar of the Constitution, but I believe it gives to the Congress the responsibility to appropriate the money for the works of the nation. And you have the power, you have the responsibility to do that. And I think most of the people at this table understand that. And quite frankly, if you do it poorly, we as the people have the opportunity to replace you. What we don't have the opportunity to do is replace the trolls in OMB who don't have to answer to the people for how their money's spent. And so I think the real simple, just to be blunt, is appropriate the money, tell them where to spend it, perhaps give flexibility for safety and similar things, but don't just hand a pot of money to someone who doesn't share your values and expect them to do with it as you would.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ms. Larson. And by the way, since I'm new to the committee, all those numbers that you were throwing out there, the 1,007, the 7,001, the Section 1024, and the 408, do you have paper on that?
I do.
Okay.
And I'll send them to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm very interested. I'd like to digest it.
Thank you. And I agree with Matt on, that the earmark moratorium probably went too far, and that was discussed in the development of WRDA 14, and the 7001 annual report section was a way to deal with that. And so I think now the committee is faced with looking where to go, and if the administration again ignores that provision. But from a larger perspective, where we are, and Matt mentioned that the inland waterway funds are not being used and we don't have the harbor maintenance funds, there is actually a provision in the House Energy and Water report that would not allow expenditure of funds for the Assistant Secretary's office until, I think, 95% of funds are spent as they are to be allocated. And that's how you hold their feet to the fire. Well, where you've got the president's budget and then there are these funding pots, the add-ons, well, some of that money is not being allocated to projects. So how do you compel the administration to do that? The House Energy and Water bill has one suggestion, and I would suggest to you at this point that's probably a good suggestion. If we collectively, the committee, the Congress, but the American people, want those appropriations to be spent as they are intended, that's a way to compel the administration to do it. And I'll find that section for you. It's in the House Energy and Water report.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
This has been a problem, the battle between the legislative branch and the executive branch, dating all the way back to the first president that started this, I think, war, and he was a hero of New Orleans. He was the battle. I think he led the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew. Or a solution.
Mr. Turner, we've talked about a number of kind of, I think, somewhat rifle shot issues in addition to some of the more macro level issues, but wanted to talk about one thing that's perhaps a little bit more of a rifle shot. Generally under project development and project delivery mechanisms, the Corps of Engineers pays a larger share of the construction cost, or maybe half the construction cost under some scenarios. But on the operations and maintenance or the life cycle cost, the non-federal sponsor, which may be you, it may be Mr. Graham's agency, or others, they are responsible for the life cycle cost. Can you talk a little bit about how motivations on different project designs may be influenced based upon that? And one thing that comes to mind perhaps is the wall, the reinforced wall in St. Bernard. We had some rust and coating issues.
Yes. And I think this is, it kind of goes back to what's been said by maybe Mr. Woodruff and others regarding how sometimes, the issues get pushed off. Either operation gets pushed into capital or capital gets pushed into operations and maintenance. And we've seen in the flood control arena many times what happens is in an effort to either meet schedule or reduce capital costs, some of the operation and maintenance requirements become rather onerous on the non-federal sponsor. And it's very difficult for non-federal interests to affect a change with the Corps in that. And we've tried very hard, and the example that you gave having to do with corrosion of steel piles under flood walls and additional stresses that develop in those things and settleable soils, all of those types of things, we brought out during the actual design process, the planning and design process, and Of course, the Corps went ahead and constructed the projects without accounting for those, and now we're finding out that we're going to have a relatively expensive monitoring system developed, and we're going to have to take care of that monitoring system to see if we're going to have problems with that wall over time. And of course, we have other examples of that with regards to some of the more complex structures that we have as well, particularly with regards to the mechanical and electrical requirements that are set forth for some of these navigational floodgates that we have to operate and maintain. And so I don't know how you can effectively address that, but certainly there has to be a way for there to be reasonable operation and maintenance costs considered when the actual design, planning and design of a project is done.
And so just to really kind of dumb this down, Chairman, you have a scenario where the Corps of Engineers is responsible for a percentage of the construction costs, but the actual life cycle, the operations, maintenance, repair, rehabilitation, replacement costs are borne by the folks here. So we have run into multiple situations where during the design or construction phase, the Corps has, let's again use a dumb example, but rather than using concrete or steel, say, well, we're just going to use paper mache. And obviously there's no sustainability there, but they turn over the keys. Now, Mr. Turner and the Corps and Mr. Graham's agency, they're all engaged in what's known as a project partnership, and I want to reinforce that word, partnership agreement. It was a new term that Congress put in place in 2007. Now, any partnership I'm in, with the exception of my wife, there's usually joint decision-making. My wife rules, I'll admit. There's joint decision-making. In this case, though, as Mr. Turner and everyone else here who signed one of these things will tell you, there is zero role that any of these folks could actually, zero ability for them to stop, prevent, force in any way the Corps of Engineers to actually take a different approach here, yet they're the ones that are left with the keys at the end of the day and maintaining the structure and expecting it to perform to the ability that it was initially designed. Mr. Okwe, and I'm laughing, Mr. Chairman, the pronunciation of Okwe. I'm not sure if you remember last time we were down here, but I'm probably not supposed to tell this story, but we were sitting there talking, and we were in South Lafourche about a bunch of people that had a little bit of an accent differently than his. And we're sitting there that night, and he goes, you know what? I figured all y'all out on this whole Cajun accent thing. This is all just a ruse. Y'all made this whole thing up. He said, it's not really an accent. He said, y'all just lazy. You just stop short in the words. That's what he's going to do.
I don't have an accent.
Yep, sure. Yeah, good luck getting around here. Mr. Okwe, there is a authorization in place for deepening of the Mississippi River system. We talked about the Panama Canal. Mr. Chairman, when we were in Panama, I think it's noteworthy that the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal locks here were designed and built by the same person as the Panama Canal, yet we've had an authorization around for 60 years now to rehab those locks, and they're still in awful shape, not rehabbed at all. But deepening the Mississippi River system, and Mr. Woodruff, certainly your industry knows this well, if you deepen it to New Orleans, you deepen it to Baton Rouge, you deepen it to your facility in between. Louisiana would be the only about the fact that the United States largely has more expensive environmental compliance, labor compliance, and tax compliance laws than many of the other countries we often compete with. The Mississippi River system and the maritime transportation system that it largely employs or allows is really a efficiency. It gives us an efficiency that still allows us to compete on global scales and compete and win in global scales because of that efficiency. Mr. Woodruff, in your industry, do you believe that an investment in deepening the Mississippi River would help to facilitate the President's objective, and do you think that would help level the playing field and absorb some of these other costs that we incur here?
Absolutely. It's important that our seaports be efficient because, and I've probably been remiss in not mentioning, we've talked a lot about the Mississippi River, but the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway is the east-west link that New Orleans is a hub of, and so that connects Dr. Babin's Port of Houston and Corpus Christi, Beaumont, Lake Charles, all of these things
Florida.
come together.
Yeah. All the way to Florida. Yeah.
All the way to Florida if we can get through the Inner Harbor, if it's working today.
You just walk it across.
But the reality is those efficient seaports make American imports less costly, make our exports more competitive in the global marketplace. We have to have efficient seaports. We have to have efficient inland waterways. We have to have a whole system of transportation because, quite frankly, that's what allows us to overcome the environmental burdens, the tax burdens, and the other burdens that we as American industry face that make us less competitive in the world marketplace. That's the one shining star we have is our efficient transportation system. If we can keep it efficient, we can compete.
Thank you. Last question. Mr. Hack, you represent largely a Chamber of Commerce-like organization, business members. I have heard you on numerous occasions espouse on the importance of coastal restoration, environmental restoration, ecological productivity. Those normally aren't phrases that you hear coming out of chamber-type organizations. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that mindset here in South Louisiana of your members and why you see that as being something that is a mainstream issue of the business community?
Yeah, well, I think there's two reasons. One is just a cultural reason, and that is that for folks living on the coast, most people either work on a rig or they're commercial fishermen. So in the same family, you're going to get both people. You know, we have a shrimp and petroleum festival, and you can be the shrimp and petroleum queen if you're lucky enough. So there's a cultural aspect to it. But the other one is just practical. We're the #2 purveyor in the country of energy, of oil and gas. We're the #2 purveyor in the country of seafood. We're a major location for tourism and culture. And the fact is that if we want to preserve those economic drivers, we have to preserve the environment that makes them plausible. A reporter once asked me in a somewhat snarky way, they said, don't you think it's a conflict of interest that the energy industry is working with you to stabilize the coast? And I said, this is not a conflict of interest, this is a confluence of interest. The energy industry is so invested in terms of billions of infrastructure and hundreds of thousands of people that they need a stable coast in order to deliver value to their shareholders. And so I think it's that hand-in-glove relationship, that codependence between the environment and the economy that we have realized, and we've said this is not an ideological issue, not a partisan issue. If you like good jobs and a good place to live, to have those jobs, then you have to support stabilizing the coast.
Mr. Chairman, I would just sum up before we leave and just how interconnected all of these things are in terms of not only flood protection but also our maritime industry and creating jobs and all of those things. But if you just look at, for example, as Parish President Rowbottom talked about her parish, but if you don't have the flood protection and you don't invest in the levees, then you have a problem shifting over to financial services in terms of the National Flood Insurance Program, where you cost people out of being able to live in their homes, live in the community. Then all of a sudden the parish of St. John the Baptist all of a sudden has no one there. And you can't operate the Port of New Orleans or you can't operate any of the refineries that we have. But when you talk to the Corps, they're not necessarily making that big connection. But the question becomes, who knows the needs of a community better? Is it the administration, is it OMB, or is it the person who only represents 750,000 people as opposed to that nearly 400 million people that the chairman referenced earlier? And I think it is very important to get member say back into the process, because we're going to know those individual needs and connect the dots much better than any administration, because the administration is worried about everything from ISIS to world peace, and we do that also, but we are very focused on making sure that our infrastructure, our citizens are safe, and that we do things to create economic development and jobs. And I think that if somehow we can get that done, it becomes very, very important. You have done a great job as chairman of transportation in trying to work all these things together, but I think in the next word of bill we have to be very, very mindful that that we know the nuances better than any administration will ever know it, and sometimes we just have to make people get together and make people think, make people do what we need them to do, because we know what those needs are. So let me thank you again for taking the time, and all the members taking the time to come down to New Orleans. I know it's a tough place to visit with not much to do. But I would just urge you to get out of your hotel room from all the studying and just enjoy the culture of the city.
Well, thank you, Mr. Richmond. Appreciate that. Thanks for your district, I know, hosting us here. We appreciate that. I understand exactly. I agree with what you're saying. We know better in our districts and our states better than I think the federal government. That was a very compelling argument to reinstate earmarks without saying it. I also want to point out that the Corps, there are members of the Corps of Engineers here in the audience. Colonel Hanson, I know, is here, district commander, and they have a tough job, and it's not always at the local level or the district level that the problem occurs. Sometimes the division, and a lot of times it comes out from on high in Washington that they've got to figure out how to put the flexibility in there that they can to make sure that the folks in the local level get the job done. And it's a tough job. I have 2 core districts that separate my district, and talking to those colonels all the time, it's, as I said, sometimes it's not the local issue, it's coming down from Washington. So, Colonel, appreciate you being here today. And I guess you got a heads up of what's coming. Thanks to the panelists for being here, taking the time today. Really appreciate it. Again, all you folks have been involved, and we hear from you regularly, which is important. We need you to continue to do that. Thanks to Mr. Graves for helping hosting us here also and setting this up. And I guess we're going to be flying around South Louisiana here shortly. Also to the other members for taking their time and coming down here to spend some time. I appreciate that. There's no substitute for being out here in the real world, seeing what's happening here from people that deal with it every day. And just finally, Mr. Graves mentioned that the president wants to expand exports, or double them, or whatever the number is over the next 10 years. Well, the reality is that coming down the road, the pike, the river, whatever pun you'll use, is over the next 20 years, we are going to double the amount of freight that gets